um, do a little bit of analysis on Elizabeth Bishop's poem In the Waiting Room, and hopefully we get this done less than 10 minutes. So this is a narrative poem. Bishop's poetry is often autobiographical. This certainly is. And it's a poem which tells a story. And again, you think about other Bishop poems and you meet characters and you're brought to specific places like, a filling station or her grandmother's home or a pigsty, and you have very distinctive settings, and that's the case here. You meet different characters in her poems, and when we meet her grandmother and we meet the family that live at the filling station, we even meet the fish, um, or we meet the pigs in the prodigal. Very distinctive characterization. Now, Aunt Consuelo, the main character who accompanies the poet in this story or this poem, she's plays a very minor role in the poem, very incidental, but she's there nevertheless, and that's what fits in. Don't forget, when you're writing these essays about poets, you're looking for connections between the poems and a distinct narrative style, a distinct setting, characterization, and indeed an engaging opening are features of Bishop's style that connect the different poems together, as well, of course, as the fact that her work is usually autobiographical, or at least inspired by events from her own life. So the opening sequence, definitely grabs our attention, draws us in. In Worcester, Massachusetts, I went with Aunt Consuelo to keep her dentist's appointment and sat and waited for her in the dentist waiting room. It was winter, it got dark early. So there's a sense of, methodical storytelling here, loads of detail, typical for Bishop. This is a poet who pays attention to incidental details, those little details that don't appear to be important but make the story plausible, realistic, and believable. And any of you planning on being successful in your Leaving Cert this year really need to pay attention to that when you're writing your composition for paper one, whether it's a short story or a personal essay or a speech. Attention to detail is often the difference between a good essay and a really, really good essay. So we're in Worcester, Massachusetts. We know the aunt's name, and we know it's winter, and we know it got dark early. And that reference to winter and darkness, for me, it's reminiscent of the opening of Sestina, where she refers to the autumnal mood and the darkness and the failing light in that poem. And we have a suggestion of mood here, a sense of melancholy, a sense of darkness. This is not going to be one of those kind of happy, sun-filled poems that we might read from a different poet, okay? We don't need to read the whole poem. It's 99 lines long, so what I'm going to do is just kind of highlight some important features of the poem. She basically tells a story. She goes to the dentist's office. Her aunt goes into the dentist. She sits outside. She's 7 years old. And she starts looking at a magazine. It's a National Geographic magazine. I'm sure you've heard of National Geographic magazine. But essentially it was a publication which for a long time, before the internet and before globalization, kind of shone a light on different cultures from around the world for people mainly from the United States. So while she waited for her aunt, I read the National Geographic, and then a little note, I could read. So the name of the magazine, and then the little note, I could read. Why would she say that? Well, it's highlighting how young she was. And then, typically for Bishop, the ability to provoke our senses, to bring a scene to life, and she does it with really photographic imagery. So she's looking at a photograph, and when we read the poem, we can see the photograph as well. And carefully studied the photographs, the inside of a volcano, black and full of ashes. Then it was spilling over in rivulets of fire. Now, when I read that, it's like reading The Fish and, looking at the big pink peony as she dissects the fish. Or it's like reading The Prodigal and seeing the sty plastered halfway up with glass smooth dung. It's like reading Sestina and bringing us in and showing us that almanac hanging on the wall, hovering half open above the child and above the grandmother. Those kinds of details are very vivid and bring Bishop's poetry to life. So we have a volcano, the adjective, it's black, and then we have the little detail that's full of ashes. And then we have that verb spilling, which is a great choice of verb, very precise. You get the sense of the movement of the lava in the image. And then that lovely note, the rivulets of fire, a rivulet like a small river, very, very clever. Combine those things together and you have really, really powerful imagery. She goes on and continues to describe, what she sees in the different pictures as she flicks through the pages of the magazine. Ossa and Martin Johnson dressed in riding breeches, a dead man slung on a pole. The caption said he was a long pig. And then you have these images of these women who are dressed in traditional clothing and traditional jewellery. She says, black naked women with necks wound round and round with wire like the necks of light bulbs. And again, this is brilliant, clever little simile. It captures the image being described so precisely, so clearly, very typical of Bishop's style of writing, very evocative, very clear. She says, I was too shy to stop, and then I looked at the cover, the yellow margins, the date. Suddenly from inside came an O of pain. Now, when she says inside, is she referring to inside the doctor's office, the dentist's office? So it's Aunt Consuelo who's crying out in pain because she's been hurt. And then we ask ourselves, is that inside coming from inside the poet? Is it a moment of epiphany, a moment of realization? And of course, very cleverly in this poem, it's both of those things. So she tells us it's Aunt Consuelo's voice. And by the way, before I move on, epiphany, that moment of clear understanding, that moment of insight, that moment, when the sunlight glazed the barnyard mud with red in the Prodigal, that moment, everything was rainbow, and I let the fish go, or somebody loves us all in Filling Station. These moments of epiphany are a feature of Bishop's poetry. She is a poet whose work is, to quote a previous exam, often analytical and, even though the exam said rarely, and often emotional. There's often deep emotional or deeply emotional moments in Bishop's poems that are worth paying attention to, and this is one of them. She goes on and she describes what happens at this crucial moment. Don't forget, she's only a child. It's a crucial moment of insight. Aunt Consuelo's voice, not very loud or long. I wasn't at all surprised. Even then I knew she was a foolish, timid woman. Look at the characterization there. I might have been embarrassed, but wasn't. What took me completely by surprise was that it was me, my voice in my mouth. So this is really interesting. Aunt Consuelo cries out and she thinks, well, she's a foolish woman. And then she realizes, hold on, it wasn't Aunt Consuelo crying out. It was me looking at these pictures. So we can see that here we have that reflective element of Bishop's poetry, which is so important and so notable. In a poem like, I mentioned already the fish, At the Fish Houses is another good example. The Armadillo is a brilliant example. We get this person who's an observer. She looks at things. She sits down and she pays attention to what's going on around her. And then she reflects upon those things and she comes to kind of insights or realizations. And that's what's happening in this poem as well. Something is happening. As she looks back on this memory, she's thinking about how it was a significant moment in her life. It had a significant impact on her. And really what the poem is about growing up. It's about the end of childhood. It's about kind of the realization that, she's not on her own, or that she doesn't live life alone, is probably more accurate way to put it. She says, what took me completely by surprise is that it was me, my voice in my mouth, without thinking at all. I was my foolish aunt. We were falling, our eyes glued to the cover of the National Geographic. And then she gives us this date, typical Bishop, attention to detail, February 1918. So is this the language and the imagery has become really quite surreal here. It's like she and her aunt have become somehow bonded. And of course, this is the moment of realization that she's having, that she thought of her aunt as a foolish, timid woman, but now she realizes that she's like her aunt, that they are similar. And this repetition of falling is really, really interesting. The repetition of foolish, we have foolish here. I should have highlighted that. And we have foolish here. to describe the ant. And then she says I, and then she changes the personal pronoun to we. And that image of falling communicates something about how she felt really deeply uncomfortable at that moment, where she realized that she and her aunt, she regarded her aunt as foolish, but then she realized that she and her aunt are very similar. And she goes on, I said to myself, 3 days and you'll be 7 years old. I was saying it to stop the sensation of falling off the round turning world into cold blue black space. I mean, wow. Fantastic use of metaphor and figurative language. She felt as if she was falling off the world, the round turning world, that reference to the turning of the world, evoking a sense of dizziness or a sense of disorientation. The image of space as cold and blue black. I love the compound word adjective blue black. I love the note that space is cold. There's this sense that the warmth of childhood, the innocence of childhood is going away, and it's been replaced by this awareness, a broader awareness of a wider, scary world. The child is somehow aware of the fact that she's like the ant and that the adult world is not alien from her. So that metaphor, that example of figurative language, captures an abstract concept. And that's what metaphors are supposed to do. They're supposed to put into easily understood form difficult to understand ideas. So that idea of sudden change, frightening change, of losing control, of suddenly feeling disorientated and not being on solid ground, is captured by this image of falling off the earth, this image of the turning, spinning earth and you falling off into cold blue black space. Fantastic writing. But I felt you are an I, you are an Elizabeth, you are one of them. Here we have ideas of identity, but also being one of them. She's one of a community. She's part of humanity. She's not just an individual. She's more than that. Aunt cries out, she cries out. She is like her aunt. She is not alone. And then we get these questions that are so typical of Bishop, these thoughtful, reflective questions. Why should you be one too? I scarcely dared to look to see what it was I was. Look at that line. I should have highlighted that. I scarcely dared to look to see what it was I was. I mean, how many of us in our lives think about who we are? How many of us try to avoid thinking about those kinds of deep philosophical concepts? Bishop doesn't avoid that in this poem. I gave a sidelong glance. I couldn't look any higher. At shadowy grey knees, trousers and skirts and boots and different pairs of hands lying under the lamps. Look at all those details there. The knees are grey and shadowy. There's trousers, there's skirts, there's boots, there's hands, and they're lying under lamps. She's looking around her. She's a child, and she's suddenly aware of all these things in the world that she wasn't aware of before. And she says, I knew that nothing stranger had ever happened, that nothing stranger could ever happen. Look at the language. Nothing stranger, ever happened, ever happen. So the repetition, again, typical for Bishop. Look at poems like the Filling Station, like The Fish, like At the Fish Houses, like The Prodigal, like Sestina, and you will see repetition used in her poems. It's a motif. And then we have the concluding section of the poem. Why should I be my aunt or me or anyone? She's thinking about identity, those idea of questions, asking questions. You see it in those poems at the Fish Houses, The Fish and Filling Station. What similarities, Boots' hands, the family voice I felt in my throat, or even the National Geographic and those awful hanging breasts held us all together or made us all just one. How I don't know any word for it. How unlikely. She's thinking about the big ticket issues of philosophy. How weird is it that all of us who are so different superficially are so alike and so connected fundamentally? That's what this poem is addressing that idea of identity and connection. And she's thinking about how unlikely that is. How had I come to be here, like them, and over here, a cry of pain that could have that could have got loud and worse but hadn't. Look at the questions. The waiting room was bright and hot, too hot. Again, too hot. She feels uncomfortable. It was sliding beneath a big black wave. Another and another. Look at that metaphor, folks. Sliding beneath a big black wave. The wave is big and the wave is black. We have this idea of drowning. This idea, again, this metaphor representing the idea of being uncomfortable, of being swept away by forces that you cannot control. In this image up here, it's gravity. In this image up here, it's the power of a wave sweeping her away. These are both images of fundamental change, and there is a sense of the fear of change. Then I was back in it. The war was on. Outside in Worcester, Massachusetts. The war, by the way, reference to the First World War. We're in February 1918, and the United States was a part of the Allied side in the First World War by 1918. Outside in Worcester, Massachusetts, were night and slush and cold. And it was still the 5th of February, 1918. I think it's a really, really clever poem. So typical of Bishop. You know, bringing us into a place, like bringing us to the filling station, or like bringing us to Samambaya, looking at the fire balloons going up, or bringing us to her granny's kitchen, bringing us to that place, establishing the setting, then introducing the characters and the mood, and then using those elements to delve into something kind of profound and thought-provoking and personal yet universal. That's the thing about Bishop. When you think about this poem, she was very young, wasn't she? Not quite 7 years old. Very young to have a moment where she knew that there was nothing stranger that had ever happened. Nothing stranger that could ever happen. Where she knew that. Very young. But we all have that moment. We all have that moment of insight. That moment of epiphany. When childhood kind of ends and we suddenly become aware of the reality of the wider world around us. And that's what the poem In the Waiting Room addresses. So there you go. I was asked to do a little summary or an explanation of that poem, and there it is, okay? Don't forget, if you're looking to contact or get notes, that's the email address that you can contact me on, and sure, we'll sort you out if we can. Thanks very much, folks.